the TMZ Behind the Bar podcast with the TMZ lawyers, Jason Beckerman and Derek Kaufman.
Welcome, everyone, to a very exciting new episode of Behind the Bar, where each week we bring our perspective to the biggest stories in celebrity news. Derek, earlier this week, the internet became a buzz when the video of David Dow, Dr. David Dow, is that his name?
Yeah,
David Dow?
David Dow, Asian Dave of the poker circuit.
Asian Dave of the poker circuit was dragged off of a United Airlines flight from Chicago to Louisville, Kentucky. It was hard to watch.
Tough. I mean, this is when you see a man's face bloody.
Yeah.
It's rough to watch.
And even harder to hear. Take a listen.
Come on.
This sounds like a man tormented. You ever seen the movie Ghost, where the black spirits sort of drag someone to hell? This sounded like a man tormented and dragged.
Yeah. In the first couple of days after the video was released, everyone, and I mean everyone, was outraged about the gruesome treatment that this guy had received. His face was cut and bloody. He was dragged off. His shirt was sort of pulled up around his neck as he's dragged off the airplane, blood streaming from his eye. But as more facts have come out, including the reasons that he was taken off the plane, and then the totally irrelevant but salacious details that he had lost his medical license for trading prescription opiates in exchange for sex.
Yeah. Convicted felon. I mean, not relevant to this case, but he had a checkered past.
The tide did begin to change, and as of the taping of this podcast, I think it's fair to say that the public opinion is on balance sort of split on whether or not we feel sympathy for this guy, or whether or not he sort of, I guess, got what was coming to him, might be a way of phrasing it.
It almost feels like the tide is turning. I'm not sure it's turned quite yet.
Yeah.
You still got the video, which is the most startling thing. But
it's pretty remarkable considering where things started to where we are now, and that's going to be the discussion on this week's Behind the Bar. I'm Jason Beckerman.
And I'm Derek Kaufman.
Derek, I have come up with 4 questions stemming from this entire morass that I think really need answering. And I know you know this case really as well as anybody and watched all the videos. And so here are my 4 questions, and do your damnedest to answer them. First, what led up to the altercation? Sort of hits, runs, and errors. Second, what right did the airline have to kick off a paying customer? He had bought a ticket, paid whatever price they were asking for it, was sitting in a seat, minding his own business, and they eventually, after some stuff that you'll talk about, they kicked him off that flight, notwithstanding he was a paying customer. Then the Chicago PD comes in and they tear him out of his seat and drag him off bloodied. What rights did the Chicago PD have to engage in these aggressive police tactics just because, again, someone is lawfully sitting in a seat? And then fourth, when he sues, and he is sure as heck going to sue, how much money is he going to get, from whom, and is he certain to win?
Yeah. So let's take these in turn. So let's go back to the facts of this. You'll remember David Dow was the person who they eventually dragged off the plane. But before this all happened, the airline needed to free up some seats because they had some flight crew that they needed to get to Louisville. Remember, this was in Chicago, and they said, we've got some flights we need to have staffed up in Louisville, so we need 4 seats. So they started auctioning off.
And this happens all the time, by the way. The airlines transport their own crew from a larger market like Chicago to a smaller market like Louisville because they need to staff a plane coming out of Louisville.
Right, and of course, the flight is overbooked, so they say, who's going to give up their seat for these people? Do I have any takers for $400? No takers. Everyone's sitting on the plane saying, I want to go home. $800, they up it. Still nobody, still silence. Rather than continuing that auction process, they flipped over to dragging someone off the flight. They said, okay, if no one's going to do this, we're going to put you through a lottery, and we're going to randomly select who gets taken off this flight. And unfortunately, David Dow got selected. So they go to his seat, and they say, hey, we're taking you off the flight. He doesn't take so kindly. He says, I'm a physician. I got to get home. I've got patients at 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. I'm not leaving. So he sits there, sort of crosses his arm, actually gets on the phone with his attorney at some point and says, I'm going to sue you guys, so leave me alone. I'm going home. Pick somebody else.
The video is a bit spotty in this part. We see some people's videos have come out. There are everybody's shooting at this point, but some videos have come out, and they sort of show different angles, but you don't show exactly the full conversation. But at some point, right, he gets on the phone with his lawyer, and he is getting, belligerent has a negative tone.
He's certainly getting
worked up and more aggressive, and sort of saying, look, you drag me out. If you threaten to drag me out of the seat, you're going to have to drag me because I'm not getting off this plane.
That's right. They say they give him that choice. They say, look, we can either drag you off or you can get off. And he says, you're going to have to drag me. There's something to that effect. So they do eventually drag him off, and that's when we get the whole spectacle. But how did we get here in the first place?
Well, in fairness, just to make a point, the cops were at all times until the dragging very calm.
Sure.
In fairness, we have to be fair to both sides here. They were very calm the entire process until they end up taking him.
Yeah, this isn't aggressive cops who are angling for a fight. It doesn't look that way, at least. They're speaking to him calmly, and it escalates to a point where they need to remove him because they need to get the flight off the ground. So how did we get here, though? What really bothers people, I think, fundamentally about this is the overbooking problem on airlines. Because you go to a movie theater, you buy your ticket, you think you're going to get a seat in the movie theater. They don't sell thousands of seats for a 100-seat movie theater. That doesn't happen. But on airlines, it does, because the economics of the airline industry is such that they factor in that not everyone's going to show up to a flight. So let's say they have 200 seats, they might sell 250 tickets. They have very sophisticated algorithms for how people show up to flights. And since the airline industry was deregulated in 1978, this has been something that all of the airlines do. They overbook their flights. It's not as heavily regulated, and they want to make sure to have a full capacity flight. So what they do is they overbook it, and then they try to get people off, because there's a formula here, right? You have a profit from your overloaded, or your profit you get from a fully booked flight minus the losses you would get from an underbooked flight, and all that wiggle room, all that excess they use to pay people to free up the seats.
And my brother asked a question of me last night when we were talking about this, and I'm sure other people have it as well, which is, well, the airline has actually sold, if you cancel your airline ticket at the last minute, you lose that money to the airline anyway, so they're not really out anything, so they shouldn't overbook. That's not necessarily true. Business travelers who pay for a fully
refundable ticket,
pay $1,000 or $1,200 for the same price, same ticket that you or I might pay $150 for, Chicago to Louisville, for example.
Sure.
But if they cancel at the last minute, they get that full $1,200 back. So there is a loss, a definitive loss that the airline has suffered when somebody cancels at the last minute.
That's right.
And they oversell the flight, overbook the flight in order to make up that stagger, make up that loss.
And then they play with that delta by giving you compensation when they get off. They're still making out. So they have these very sophisticated algorithms that they employ. But it just seems wrong, because people get on a flight and they think, I have a ticket, I have a right to go home. Unfortunately, that's not fully how it works. Now, usually what you'll see is this auction go on at the gate, and there's a good reason for that, because there's something called the endowment effect in behavioral economics. This all went on when people were seated on the flight. You know this, Jason. If you go to the airport, by the time you board the flight and you buckle your seatbelt, you feel like you've psychologically taken that step that you're going home.
So they try to do this at the gate before people get on the plane, but in this case, it didn't work out that way.
It didn't work out that way, and so when you get on the flight, your willingness to accept a price to get off it is going to go way through the roof, and they really couldn't get to that number.
I got my book out in front of me. I've already dealt with getting my bag in the overhead. I don't want to get off the plane at this point.
But off the plane, before you board, maybe $800 seems great. You're like, hey, there's a Starbucks over there. I'll kick it for a little while. I'll get on a flight in 2 hours. That's a totally different experiment. So I think the first problem they faced was, usually this is done at the gate. This was done on board, and maybe the exigencies of the of the situation were such that they didn't know until they were boarded.
And also compounding it in this situation, it had to be an overnight stay. There was not a flight 2 hours later. They were going to have to send them to a hotel, check in, and for somebody like Dr. Dow, who claimed he had patients to see the next morning, that was unworkable for him, but unfortunately he lost the lottery, and he was the one. You can't just say, well, this guy says he's really busy, we're going to go after somebody who says they're less busy. You can't do that, because it would screw up the motivation.
That's right. That would be terrible for business. So then the next obvious question that you asked is, does he have a right to sit there? Now, they brought on the cops, and they dragged him off, and everyone's saying, you can't do that. The guy paid for his ticket. He probably went to Orbitz, booked a ticket. He had a valid ticket to sit on that airplane. Not so much. So we looked into it a little bit, and the Department of Transportation, there's a aviation consumer protection division that actually handles all of this, and there's something called involuntary bumping. That's the term for it. So the voluntary bumping is, okay, I'll accept your $400, I'll accept your $800, I'll get off the flight, and I'll take my voucher. If they can't get people that way, they can bump people, and actually more than 40,000 people out of the 650 million flyers were involuntarily bumped in 2015.
It's an incredible amount.
It's a huge number.
I've never
it's
seen it
120
happen.
a day.
I've never seen it happen. You know why I've never seen it happen? Because it doesn't happen on the plane. It happens out front when somebody comes to the gate, and then they offer them the money, typically sell it. But if not, they say, sir, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get on this plane. We got another one for you in 3 hours.
That's right. And usually it's a calmer transaction, but it was shockingly common to me. United Airlines actually ranks 5th out of 12 major airlines in their bump rate. 3,800 involuntarily bumped out of their 86 million passengers, around 10 a day. So we see this one that makes huge headlines. This is actually happening all the time. There's actually statistics on this. The worst airlines for bumping are SkyWest, Southwest, and ExpressJet. The best airlines, so most likely to get to your destination without being bumped, are Hawaiian, Delta, and Virgin. That's just the raw statistics out there. And we'll go into that a little bit later, but I want to now move to your question, which is, the cops came on board. They handled him in such a manner that he ended up with a bloody face. Is that a problem, Jason?
Well, it's a huge problem from a public relations standpoint, both for United and for the Chicago Police Department or the division of the Chicago PD that handles the airport, which I'm not quite sure how that works, but there is some division, just like there is in L.A. We know there's an airport division of the LAPD. It's a real black mark for them, certainly, and they were very rough with him. There was some talk that they could have lifted an armrest, which would have really mitigated some of the physical damage they did to him as they were dragging him off.
Because his face actually hit the armrest. They didn't punch him or anything.
But unfortunately for Dr. Dow, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit when it comes to lawsuits and what he's going to be able to do. You know, at this point, because this law is so quirky, the federal aviation guidelines are so quirky, at this point he becomes something of a trespasser, right? Because there's a contract when you buy a ticket, and that contract says, and this is news for each and every one of us, and I learned it in the course of the last few days, that says when I buy a ticket, I can be involuntarily bumped, and I have no right to do anything about it. And so,
it's Delta's plane, or it's United's plane.
That's right.
That is their property.
And when you enter into, obviously, right? When you buy a ticket to an airplane, you have a contract. When you're buying a ticket to Disneyland, you have a contract. There's certain activities that you can undertake within Disneyland that are going to get kicked out of the park. You're not going to get a refund. Why? Because if you look at the small print on the ticket or on the website or wherever it is, it's there. Here in the small print of buying any airline ticket, you're going to see that you can be involuntarily bumped. That's part of the contract.
When we say contract, you and I think of contracts that two parties come to a meeting of the minds, they negotiate a contract. These are really more contracts of adhesion. When you buy a ticket, you sign on to that contract.
We all know every time you download a piece of software, there's huge language nobody's ever read in the history of the world, but you click on the accept. You're doing the same thing in effect when you click on your website or on your browser to buy this ticket.
Right.
And so when the cops come on, they're in this position that they have to enforce United's contractual rights to get this guy off the plane. They seem to be calm, but then everything went haywire at the last minute, and they just ripped this guy off. And there's a lot of talk about what means they should have used to get him off, but did they have the right to take him off? I think it's pretty hard to say no, even though it's sort of unseemly and ghastly. But they had and frankly, the Chicago PD had the obligation at that point to enforce the law.
They were called on to enforce a contractual right, which was perfectly valid of United to assert. And you're in these close quarters. There's only so much that they can do to remove him in a calm manner, right? You've got to pull him over a seat. There's an armrest there. Maybe you can lift it up.
That's a big thing, though. They didn't lift up the armrest because he's seen in the video being dragged across his armrest, and maybe where he hit his head and the whole thing caused the blood. But had they lifted up the armrest, which anybody who's flown knows that the center armrest lifts.
Yes, but that outside armrest, which is actually where he hits his head, apparently those lift as well, but that's some sort of secret button that I don't think everyone's familiar with. Yeah, because what happened was he tripped over the middle armrest, and then he hits the aisle armrest.
Well, he was in the middle armrest, middle seat to begin with. I thought there was some damage done as he was pulling. Anyway, we're getting far afield here. So did they have the right to do it? Yes. Could they have done it in a sort of more gentle manner? It seems they could have, but we weren't there. You always hear that cops will say, look, until you're in the situation, you don't know what it's like when you have a very feisty customer. And he was fighting back. There's no question about it.
Definitely.
He was not a compliant.
At best, he went dead weight and made them sort of drag him in that manner. And really, when you have some blood involved, it's just going to make a gory video by definition.
And the sound.
That's going to look
and the
good.
sound.
Yeah.
So the ultimate question that I asked, I guess I can answer it based on what we've talked about already, is if he sues, and he certainly is going to sue, he'll sue United and he'll sue the Chicago Police Department. What do we think he's going to get from them? And, I think we were both horrified by this video, and it's very tough to watch, and it's disgusting. And the FAA regulations are what they are. We don't have to agree with them, but they are what they are. The law of the land. I think ultimately, Dr. David Dow gets zero if this case goes to trial, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, remember, United stock yesterday and today has been getting hammered. This is how stock prices move in relation to these sort of nightmares, and they may want to stop the bleeding from a PR perspective just to calm their investors down, and they may pay them some sort of nuisance settlement because they got hammered. They lost nearly hundreds of millions in market cap in one day, so they may want to stop the bleeding on this and just pay him a nuisance settlement. But you're right. Is he entitled to much? I don't see it. I really don't see the merits of his lawsuit. However, there's a silver lining for him, Jason. Because he was involuntarily removed, there are policies at the Department of Transportation, and if you're removed and not able to be transported to your destination for 2 or more hours, which in this case clearly
overnight
satisfied
flight.
It was going to be overnight, you're entitled to 400% of your one-way fare up to $1,350. So that's at a baseline. That's what the airlines have to pay. They can negotiate their own fees, but that's the minimum.
Well, how much is he really going to get, though? Because a one-way fare, I'm sure, assuming he bought a round-trip ticket, you're going to chop that in half. Louisville to Chicago can't be more than $200.
Right.
And so maybe $100 one-way fare. I'm thinking that he gets, what, 3 times you said?
Yeah, 400%.
Four times.
Yeah.
So he gets $400 for this. Not much in the way of recompense for getting your face bloodied and sort of embarrassed on the entire universe of the internet.
And what's interesting is if there were a flight within a half an hour, let's say within 1 hour he could get on a different flight, even though it was involuntarily bumped, you're entitled to zilch.
Yeah.
You get nothing. They're allowed to kick you off, put you on another flight within an hour, and not pay you a dime. So words of the wise, take that first $400 when they're doing the auction, because you could end up in a flight.
$800, right?
Or take the $800.
Well,
yeah.
but then you have to lose the lottery. The chances are that you're not going to get involuntarily bumped. He did, but it really is remarkable that United Airlines could kick a seated passenger off of their plane who was already there, had paid for his ticket. The Chicago PD could come, and this guy is simply asserting to the world that this is his seat and he's not going to get up. They can rough him up, they can drag him off, and most likely, unless
what about an excessive force claim against the cops?
Let's talk about United just to finish that up. He'll likely get some sort of nuisance settlement value, which is a couple $1,000 really, or he'll end up settling for $400. And frankly, they're not going to pay him that until he agrees to release them for the claims against him. So
almost certainly,
we'll see what he actually gets. Excessive force claims against the cops really
tough.
Almost impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is almost impossible. You see cases in which people, we've seen these videos come out from Rodney King forward, get the snot kicked out of them by the police in much sort of, more delicate or more, controversial circumstances than we have here. And the people sue and they get nothing. It's very hard to sue the police for actions within the line of duty.
Here we seem to have calibrated force, too.
Yeah.
They didn't take out their tasers. They didn't take out their batons. They didn't punch him.
They
just dragged him,
no
which is what they needed
allegations
to
of
do.
a racial motive like there might be in other cases. So I think the Chicago PD walks away from this and they will say, we're not going to give you a penny.
Yeah. So I've got some tips. So how do you avoid this involuntary bumping, Jason?
Don't
so you're,
fly.
You're on your flight. The first tip would be don't fly, never leave your home.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one tip. But if you actually want to take a trip, there's a couple things to do. So one is to arrive early to the airport. A lot of the airlines, when they're doing the involuntary bumping, they actually privilege people who have arrived early. You know how you're supposed to get there an hour before check-in time? So actually the latest check-ins are the most vulnerable on some airlines to be involuntarily
That actually
bumped.
makes more sense than a lottery does. I mean, the airlines are always telling you to get to the airport early. Nobody ever pays. I don't pay attention to that.
I don't either, but I might start. Yeah. The second is spring for the more expensive seats, which hurts my soul. You know that I would never like to do that. I always search on Orbitz for the least expensive, then I go to the airline. But some airlines show a preference for the expensive seats, and they'll kick out the cheap seat guys. They say, look, this comes with the territory of getting a bargain seat, so we're going to kick out the cheapies first.
What the FAA would have to say about that? That seems a little wrong to do.
It does seem a little shady, but some of them apparently do it. And the third, which I like the most, is fly Delta. So I'm not trying to give a pitch for Delta, but Delta has an ingenious solution.
Hold on. Let's
this.
rewind that. Let's ask Delta for a few bucks for the podcast before you're going to say fly Delta.
But Delta has a unique way to address this problem, which I love. So when you check in online on Delta, the computer asks you, what's your bumping price? What would you accept to take a later flight and fly on standby on a different flight? And so you're doing this at the check-in counter without looking at your fellow people about how much you would accept. You're in the silo, and you just click what that amount is. And if you say a low amount, you have a chance of actually being kicked off. If you put a high amount, they're less likely to kick you off.
I think the lesson to be learned here is that if Delta wants this to make air, they're going to need to pay us.
Yeah, I'm going to need something.
I'm
a little sweetheart
not
deal.
to do that.
A few flights. All right, Parker, lay it on us. Mail time.
All right, mail time. Remember to write in your questions and comments to behindthebar@tmz.com. First one up is from Anthony. Hey guys, love the podcast. I was wondering, since Tomi Lahren has now been fired from her job at the Blaze Network, many believe it's due to her pro-choice discussion on The View. She said that she's pro-choice. And the Blaze is a well-known conservative network owned by Glenn Beck. Is there any chance Tomi could file a lawsuit?
So we get this question as much as we get any question, which is when a private employer fires someone for exercising their free speech rights, can the person sue the employer for a violation of the constitutional
They can
rights?
if they'd like to, but I don't think it'd be successful.
No. So here's the thing: we do not have free speech rights against private enterprises. We have them against the state only: federal government, state government, local government. If they deprive you of your free speech rights, most of the time you can sue and you can be victorious. Against a private enterprise, especially your employer, you have no free speech rights whatsoever. They could say to Tomi Lahren, as a condition of your employment here, and you don't have to you don't have to be an employee, but as a condition of your employment here, you may not speak period, outside of your job. As a matter of fact, you have to go into a monastic life of silence. You may not speak a word to anybody about anything, ever.
They could say every morning you have to come in and salute me with a Heil.
And if she said or wrote, because she's not allowed to talk, sounds good to me and signed the contract, that's the end of the discussion. So the fact that they had in their contract these provisions that allowed them to terminate her, so they say, and she disputes this, but allowed them to terminate her for saying things that did not befit the company, and they chose to evoke that here. She has zero constitutional right to be immune. Zero immune from being fired for those comments.
I have a broader question. What do you think accounts for this persistent, like, sort of misperception about how free speech works? Because it does feel wrong to people, but it's one of those interesting things. We did it with Duck Dynasty, I remember. We did it with Colin Kaepernick.
Yep.
This comes up constantly, and for a lawyer, it seems like, it's fine. The employer doesn't want to hire someone like that. It resonates very differently with lawyers than it does with people who are not lawyers.
You know, we Americans are very protective of our free speech rights, and we know a lot about them. You know, from different media, we know a lot about our free speech rights, and we think that they're broader than they are. As a general rule, I mean, the government can even restrict free speech rights. We see it all the time with public school teachers who want to make comments on Facebook or want to be friends with certain people on Facebook, want to be friends with, their former students or current students on Facebook, or want to make political commentary on Facebook, and they get fired for it. And they're like, wait a second, this is even a state actor.
Right.
It's like, well, too bad. You chose to be an employee of the school district, and there are certain limitations on what you can say. It's a contractual right. You know, you can enter into a contract to give up any constitutional rights you want. You can enter into a contract. You do it. You see it in plea bargains all the time, right? I no longer I'm going to waive my Fifth Amendment rights against searches and seizures in exchange for being allowed out of prison early or allowed out of jail early, and that you contract to give up your constitutional rights. That happens all the time. And a private employer, you have a contract with them, it says you can't do certain things, they can fire you for whatever reason they want.
That's depressing.
So choke on that, everyone.
Be careful.
Your rights aren't as broad as you think.
All right, next one up is from Gwen. I just finished listening to your last episode, which is about the poor actions and decisions of Ezekiel and Cuba that did/made. I was just as disappointed in both of your comments regarding both of these situations.
Oh, man.
I don't like when someone's disappointed in me. It's worse.
No matter who you are or where the assault happened, it is an assault on someone, and if it's not allowed, known, or unwarranted by the receiver. Both of these situations are considered unlawful and should be treated as such. This is why young men think it's okay to do crap like this to women. People like you saying, well, she was at Mardi Gras and they usually flash their breasts for beads, so technically it could be hard to prove in court. Makes men think they can get away with this.
I'm sorry, who's the questioner?
Gwen.
Yeah, look, I know that this is one of those topics that is very hot button, and I thought I was careful to say that, look, I don't want to say any of these women, quote, had it coming or were asking for it. And I know there's a delicate balance, but what Jason and I were trying to convey, and apparently failed in some respects, were that the context does matter. Sarah Paulson has come out and said, I was engaging in playful banter with Cuba Gooding Jr. He's a dear friend of mine. No harm, no foul. So we were trying to say that there maybe is not open consent where someone says, yes, please grab me, but there may be contextual kind of consent in the nature of Cuba Gooding's relationship with Sarah Paulson. And that's all we were trying to get at. We apologize if we offended anyone, but that's really what my perspective.
Yeah, our aim with this podcast is really to bring what little legal perspective and experience we have to the issues of the day, and sometimes that means taking a very forensic legal approach to the questions that are posed by what happens in the world, right? Did Ezekiel commit a sexual offense? The fact that it was unseemly, and the fact that it was offensive, and the fact that it is emotionally disturbing to watch is somewhat irrelevant for the discussion of whether or not it's illegal.
Right.
And sometimes things that are offensive are not illegal. We saw it today with the podcast about Dr. David Dow being pulled off the plane. Offensive, gruesome, hard to watch, hard to listen to, but not necessarily illegal.
Right.
And I don't think that we should change the opinions that we give about the legal ramifications of something just because it is not what people want to hear about what a situation that happened.
Yeah,
and I wouldn't want to be in that position, frankly.
Right. These are emotional issues, and often we're applying reason divorced from that kind of passion, and it reads as callous. But that is certainly not our intention. So we're really just trying to be a cooling saucer and analyze these things objectively from a legal perspective.
Yep.
All right, and that is it for Mail Time.
Oh, what a great note to end on, Parker. Someone hating us. Well done. Way to stack it.
So thanks once again, everybody. Pull out your cell phones if you would. Go to the podcast store, click on TMZ's Behind the Bar, and subscribe. It helps us a ton, and we will see you next week with another scintillating episode of Behind the Bar.
Send in those questions.
Thanks for watching. If you want more nerdy deep dives into the legal side of celebrity news, hit our subscribe button right here.
And check out our previous episode over here.